All right, we are starting a new unit. It is called Anatomy Basics. So in this unit, we're going to go over the basics of 3 different body systems. We're going to start with the nervous system, which is talking about the brain and the spinal cord and all the nerves in your body. Then we're going to go into the circulatory system, there we go, which is blood and your heart. And then lastly, we'll get into the digestive system, which obviously is like your stomach and intestines. These are the very basics, so if you plan on going into Anat and Phys sometime in the next 3 years of your high school career, everything that you do in this unit, you will need to know going into that class. So any of the diagrams that we use, any of the notes you take, I would definitely keep those. They might help you, give you the foundation at least to review from before you go into anatomy. So let's get started. Again, we're going to start with the nervous system. And in this video, we are going to cover 2 different things. We're going to cover what the nervous system basically is and its overall function in the body. And then we'll talk about the 2 different types. And then we are going to look at the parts of a neuron. So on Google Classroom, you should be able to find the neuron diagram. You are going to be using that with these slides to label and take notes on the different parts of the neuron. So the function of the nervous system, again, this is like your brain and spinal cord and all the nerves in your body. The function of all of that is to basically communicate throughout the body. It's the information highway, a lot of people call it, and it actually controls all of the different body systems. It's kind of like the nucleus of a cell. The nucleus of the cell kind of controls the cell and makes sure that every organelle is doing what it's supposed to be doing. The nervous system does the exact same thing. Now we are going to break the nervous system down into 2 different types. And these are the very basic types. There are branches off of some of these types, but we're just going to go over 2. So the first one is going to be the central nervous system, and we can abbreviate that as CNS. Now the central nervous system consists of 2 things, and they're the most important things in your body. It is going to be your brain and your spinal cord. Your spinal cord is housed in your spine. We have those bony vertebrae that surround it to protect your spinal cord. But as you probably know, if you get some sort of a spinal cord injury, like you have something that severs or cuts your spinal cord at a certain point, you become paralyzed from that point down, because the information from your lower body would not be able to travel up your spinal cord anymore because there is a boulder in the road or the road stops and it can't get up to the brain. So your brain and spinal cord are super, super important. That's why they're housed in really thick bone. Your brain is protected by your thick skull and your spinal cord is protected by your spine. So here we have a flow chart. If this helps you, you are more than welcome to write this down. So the first type of nervous system that we're talking about is the central nervous system, again abbreviated CNS, and is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The second system, or second type of nervous system that we are going to talk about is the peripheral nervous system, and that is abbreviated PNS. Now, the peripheral nervous system consists of all of the nerves that branch off of your spinal cord, and you have a lot of them. If you've ever been to the Body Worlds exhibit, it used to be at the Milwaukee Zoo every now and then, they actually show you like all the nerves that are branching throughout your body, and it's kind of like insane. So this is going to be the peripheral nervous system. All of these nerves that make up the peripheral nervous system, again, are going to go back to the spinal cord, and the brain. So they're kind of like all of the little roads in a town. They all eventually are going to lead you to the highway. Now, a nerve cell, since we are talking about nerves, right, is also called a neuron, and I want you to remember that. Now, there's two types of neurons in the body, and these, again, are a part of that peripheral nervous system. You have your sensory neurons. Those are going to carry sensory information from your body to your brain or the central nervous system. So for instance, when you touch something that is hot, like a pan that is sitting on the stove, you know it's hot because your sensory neurons are carrying that temperature information from your fingertips that are touching that hot pot up to your brain, and your brain is perceiving it as a hot temperature. Okay? Also, when you step on a Lego, right, you know that it hurts because the nerves in your foot, the sensory neurons, are going to send that information up into your brain. Your brain is going to perceive that as pain. So those are your sensory neurons. Your motor neurons are going to carry information from your brain to your body. Okay, so that would be like when you're touching the hot pan on the stove. Your sensory neurons are telling your brain what you're feeling, and your brain is perceiving it as hot. Your brain then knows if you're touching something hot that you need to take your hand off of it. So your brain is going to send via motor neurons a signal to your hand to move it away. Likewise, when you step on a Lego, right, the neurons are going to tell your brain that you are in pain because there's something underneath your foot pushing on it that's uncomfortable. Your brain is going to send information down your spinal cord, down your motor neurons into your leg, and your leg is going to step up off of the Lego. And this happens really super fast. We don't hold our fingers on a hot stove and wait until our brain tells us to take it off 5 minutes later. It's basically instant. That's how fast the nervous system is. So if we complete this flow chart here, the two types of nervous system that we are talking about, we have the central nervous system, abbreviated CNS, and that is going to be your brain and spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, known as the PNS, and that is going to be your nerves, and you have sensory and motor. Now, we are going to look at what a nerve actually looks like. You should be able to find this diagram on Google Classroom. This is a resource that I made to hopefully help you take notes a little easier and something to study off of. So when you open this document, you'll have to go to File, click on Make a Copy. It'll make you a copy that you can then edit, and you should be able to, in all the boxes, be able to label them and then take notes in each box. So the first part of the neuron that we are going to talk about is the cell body. The cell body is that dark, kind of purplish oval, and some of that pink that's surrounding it. Okay, this is the part of the neuron that contains a nucleus, and the function of the cell body is to control the neuron. It's kind of like the function of the nucleus in the cell, right? The nucleus's function in a regular cell is to control the cell. The cell body of a neuron its job is to control the neuron. The next part of the neuron that we are going to talk about are the dendrites. So you'll notice coming off of that cell body, there are these hair-like extensions. Those are the dendrites. And the function of the dendrites is to receive signals from the previous neuron. So in the diagram, both the one you should be taking notes on and the one in this slide, you see to the left of the labeled neuron, there's kind of the ending of a neighboring neuron. So what happens is your body's just kind of filled with these long chains of neurons. So whatever is going to start the signal is going to send the signal down one neuron, it's going to jump to the next one, send it down that neuron, and then it's going to jump to the next one, etc., etc. It's kind of like, I like to make the metaphor to the game telephone. If you've never played telephone before, it's where you basically just sit in a line or you sit in a circle, and the first person whispers something into someone's ear, some sort of a sentence. That person who had it whispered into their ear then whispers it, whatever they heard, into the next person's ear, and then so on and so forth until it gets to the last person who says whatever they heard, and it usually doesn't ever match with the beginning sentence. So the whispering into the next person's ear, that person's ear that I'm whispering into is kind of like the dendrites of a neuron. So if someone whispers, "the sky is blue," into my ear, and I whisper, "the sky is blue," into the next person's ear, that next person's ear is like the dendrites. It's receiving the sentence from the previous person, just like how the dendrites receive the signal from the previous neuron. Then the signal is going to travel down the long extension called the axon. And that's really what the axon does. It just continues to move the signal down toward or down the neuron. So we have the signal starting at the dendrites, it'll move through the cell body, and then it'll move down the axon. So the axon is kind of that long, skinny piece of the neuron. You'll notice that there are these, what look like yellow beads, kind of covering the axon. Those are the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is they're just kind of like these fat bodies that cover the axon. You can think of them maybe like just fat cells that are covering the axon. And the point of the myelin sheath is to insulate the axon to help that signal travel faster. It's kind of like why we coat electrical wires with rubber. It's to keep all of the electricity and the energy going through that wire and not dispersing it into the environment. We want to keep that signal. We want to make it go as fast as it can go, obviously, and we don't want to lose any of it. So like for instance, if I had my hand on a hot stove, I don't want the signal to take forever to get to my brain and to get back to my arm telling me to pick my arm up. That's the point of the myelin sheath. It's to help this signal travel fast. The ending of the neuron is going to be called the axon terminals. The point of these is to release substances that are going to transmit the signal to the next neuron. So when I'm whispering something into the person's ear in telephone, I would be the axon terminal. I'm giving the signal to the next person, and the other person's ear would be like the next neuron's dendrites. Okay, so we start the neuron. Let's go back a second here. With the dendrites, the signal is coming from the previous neuron, comes to the dendrites. It's going to travel down the axon to the axon terminal. So that's how it gets from the start of the neuron to the end. And it says here the axon terminal releases substances that are going to transmit the message. So you'll notice how these neurons aren't touching each other. There's actually a gap between each neuron, and that gap is called a synapse. The synapse really doesn't have a function. I'm not entirely sure why neurons don't just connect to each other, but they do have gaps in between them, kind of like how you have a gap between your mouth and the other person's ear when you whisper to them. And then those substances that are transmitted across the synapse Those are called neurotransmitters. So the axon terminal is going to release these neurotransmitters, which are just chemical messengers that are going to jump the synapse, and they are going to kind of send the signal to the next neuron. So you can think of the neurotransmitters as words in the game telephone. If I'm whispering something into the other person's ears, my sound waves, or those words that I'm speaking, are jumping the gap and going into the next person's ears. So neurotransmitters are going to, whatever the message that the neurons want to send, there's going to be a very specific mix of chemicals that jump that gap, and those chemicals will tell the next neuron what signal to send on and on and on and on. That's the end of this video. I just want to make sure that you have your neuron diagram labeled correctly. So make sure that you have the same labels as what I have on the slide right now, and make sure that you have notes for each. So you will need to know how to label a neuron correctly, and you will need to know the function of each part, except the synapse doesn't really have a function. But the other 5, you will need to make sure that you understand the function of each.